Hey everyone, welcome back to Gotcha Interact. In today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about the new Imaginarium Theatre Season 2. And this go around, we have the Hydro, Cryo, and Animo element that we can use. Now, alongside of the supporting cast, which we might talk about a little bit later, and the alternate cast, there's some interesting lineups that we can do, and it's actually really pushing what seems to be like freeze teams, which a lot of people, of course, are going to argue is out of the meta. But I actually like this Imaginarium Theatre because of that, and it's pushing something that's not usually looked at too often anymore. So once we dive into this, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, Vixen, on that, just because I know you do have a lot of those cryo characters. I know you have Ayaka, Risley, whereas I don't. So this kind of go around, I was very hydro heavy for me. But for you, maybe you had a lot more of the cryo go around. But looking at some of the lineups here and really actually just some of the enemies, I think the biggest thing when it comes to Imaginarium Theatre is not necessarily the buffs you get with the wondrous boons or even some of the lineups, because I feel like a lot of the time you can just mix match a lot of different characters as long as you've got your on-fielder and your off-fielders. Because I've had a lot of like what people would consider quote bad matchups are, but I still typically do okay because of just the lineups and the enemies you are fighting. I think the biggest thing is the enemies and knowing how to actually go about destroying and killing them. So when it comes to like the first boss, for example, this go around was the seahorse, and so knowing that that has an electro pearl thing on it that you want to get rid of, when you just know things that like Hydro doesn't do too well at getting rid of it, but Cryo does, really if you just use any cryo characters, you're going to do pretty okay. You do have a big buffer of time. Like, I just used the trial Ayaka because, like I was saying earlier, I don't really have any cryo characters on my account in terms of 5 stars. So Ayaka really pulled some weight there, even though I wasn't really buffing her that much. Now, when you look at the Emperor of Fire and Iron, obviously, a lot of Hydro characters, most of the Hydro characters, do very well against that. And if you don't have some of the 5 stars like Nervalette, Ayato, maybe you don't even have Kokomi, well, really, Barbara is actually pretty good as an on-fielder for that just because of her Hydro application. And so I could go on and on and on about how, you need to use these different teams and make sure you're always using Nervalette with Farina. Well, when it comes to Imaginarium Theatre, I don't think you have to use the best teams. Like, Nervalette doesn't have to be in his best team, right? He already does so well by himself that I found myself actually not using Farina with Nervalette this entire Imaginarium Theatre just because I wanted to use Farina with some other teams, and Nervalette was already powerful enough without her. So Vixen, what are some of your initial thoughts, maybe some tips you can share with how you tackle this Imaginarium Theatre?
Well, I think that the first thing to look at when looking at the Imaginarium Theatre, like you have already talked about, using like the cryo characters obviously against the seahorse boss, using hydro characters against the Emperor of Fire and Iron, and then making sure you have a bow character for the last boss as well to make sure you can knock him out of the air. Now, I think the biggest thing, like you said though, was a pretty good insight, is looking at, you're fighting multiple different enemies. So when you go to choose an enemy for most of the fights, except for the bigger 3 bosses, it's multiple different enemies that you can choose. So like you said, it's not focused on what characters you get, because honestly the whole point of the Imaginarium Theatre is to kind of be a toss-up. It's to kind of test your account a little bit on its versatility, and so using different characters with other characters that you probably normally wouldn't put together. It's not like the Spiral Abyss where you get to just choose a 4-person team. It's a little bit more difficult to actually kind of flesh things out. Like you said, you didn't use Nervalette with Farina, and normally you would, especially in the Spiral Abyss. That makes a lot of sense, doing that on one side, and then you can kind of mix and match on the other side who you want on, a different 4-person team. But with this, you kind of have to think, okay, each character has 2 energy, each character needs to do this, and that's how you kind of need to make sure that the different characters can kind of follow each other. With the Imaginarium Theatre, you're trying to figure out, okay, this character only has 2 energy. Do I really want to use up my Nervalette and Farina at the same time? Being some of the strongest characters in my account, it's specifically in this run, do I really want to give that up? For me, it was that way. I did have Risley and Ayaka, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't burn out Nervalette and Farina immediately because of how strong they are on my account. I didn't have characters like Raiden, Arlecchino, Alhaitham. They just weren't a part of the Imaginarium Theatre this time. So I had to bank on a different set on my account. I had to be a little bit more versatile in my thoughts on what my characters were going to do. So I think it really just does depend. And you talked about using Barbara, for instance, on the Emperor of Fire and Iron, and that even came out for me. I didn't have Novelette actually at that point by the time the Emperor of Fire and Iron came, and so I actually had to use Barbara to constantly take out the Pyro Bar or the Pyro Shield on the Emperor of Fire and Iron and use her charge attacks because none of my other characters could actually get up that high. So it's stuff like that that you have to just use around your account that you don't know and normally use and put together. For instance, if I was going to go against the Emperor of Fire and Iron and the Spiral Abyss, I just put Novelette and Farina together and call it a day. But with the Imaginarium Theater, it bends the rules a little bit to the point where it actually makes you think, especially with the limited amount of characters that it gives you and the chance of the characters that it gives you as well.
Yeah, I know for me, when I was up against the Eon Blight Drake in the last boss on the Act 8, I used Yelan. Yelan's amazing. But I could also see people using that trial Farazan if you want to save Zhao and Farazan for last. I could totally see that working. But yeah, like you said, definitely want to make sure you have that bow character, because once he's in the air, it's a little difficult to get him back down if you don't have a bow character. You really just have to wait. And then on top of that, his resistances are just increased because you're not putting him into the stun state where you can actually deal more damage and get that res shred off on him. So definitely agree with you on that. But I'm kind of curious, what specifically, Vixen, did you do for your teams on those bosses, if you can remember? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, for the bosses, I'm pretty sure what I did was a little bit of mix and match and kind of changing things up. I believe for the original or the first boss, which is the Seahorse, forgot its name, but basically for that boss, I did use my Ayaka, so it was a lot easier. Obviously, having that character was very good. For the Emperor of Fire and Iron, I believe I used Risley, Barbara, Diona, or Charlotte for that team. And that's just because, once again, I needed a healer on the team while also having, just somebody else to just, once again, double cryo, double hydro, just trying to make sure I can try to take out that shield as much as possible. But even Yelan's, ultimate hits or her coordinated attacks weren't even that useful against it. And then the final boss, though, and that's why I had to use Barbara consistently to take out with her charge attacks, to take out his shield. And then I just went in overhaul with Yelan's coordinated attacks and Risley's normal and charge attacks to actually kill him. But then the final boss, I actually used the Eon Blight Drake. I used a Zhao Farazan team. I don't believe I had the the greatness of using Farina in that team or Shan Yu, and I believe I already used them up actually to create some swirl reactions on other teams, and then I already used her up on a previous Zhao team, I believe. But when the time came, I knew I wanted to at least keep Zhao and Farazan because they were going to be extremely good together, and my Farina was already used up, so I believe I used Zhao, Farazan, Jean, and Dia actually for that specific team, which was still pretty helpful. The pyro application, I guess, was a little bit helpful to more or less just help me not, with the resistance, I guess, to help a little bit more with Zhao so he wasn't getting knocked out of his, plunge, especially with how often the Eon Blight Drake hits. Obviously, Farazan hit the wings and brought the Eon Blight Drake down, and Zhao does a bunch of damage. And then Jean was purely there just to be a healer for Zhao so that he wasn't going to get extremely low in his HP.
Yeah, so for me, like I said, I did Ayaka because I, once again, don't have cryo characters. She did pretty well, taking off the Electro Shield on the Seahorse. And then for Emperor of Fire and Iron, I think most people are, if they have Nervalette, are going to try to use Nervalette there. But I do think Ayato does pretty well. I even mentioned Barbara. Like, just get the Hydro application, and even your off-fielders, if they're damage dealers, like heck, just use Rosaria, Xingqiu, if you're on the budget-friendly side, and you'll get that boss whittled down in no time. Actually, you brought up a really great point, Vixen, in that you can choose, kind of, in a sense, the different enemies you face against with, going into your next act. So that is very nice. If you know that, like for me, for example, I don't have a lot of cryo that I've already said like 500 times. So I know that when I'm going into face certain enemies, I try to choose the enemy types that I don't necessarily need to freeze, or like for one example, there was a level where you could choose where it was all hydro mimics. And I'm like, well, I have a very hydro heavy account, so that's not going to do too well for me. And because I just don't have the cryo characters to deal with that. But in another scenario, because Nahida is actually one of those special guest characters, and a lot of people are going to have Nahida. So if you also happen to have Nilu, you could pair those two together and just do Nahida on field with maybe like a good healer if you have Sijuin or just Kokomi, just try to keep her alive, because that would be kind of hard, because Nahida is a little squishy with all that bloom, and those Hydra Mimics do a lot of AoE attacks. But that is another interesting route you could do. And you could even just find someone else's Nilou in their lineups of their supporting cast. And that's another great thing about the Imaginarium Theatre in general. I know, Vixen, you actually wanted to talk about the supporting cast a little bit, and how maybe we could recommend other players what characters they could put up in their supporting cast. So what are your 2 cents on that?
Well, looking at the supporting cast, we actually talked about this beforehand, and we weren't really sure if we wanted to bring this up, but because it's really not too much of a big hot topic for a lot of players to really keep in mind for what they actually want to do. A lot of people are focusing on their own clears and on their own ideas. So it's not really something that a lot of people are going to focus on. But because it is something in topic of something that's still in the game, that's just what we're all about. It's just discussion. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Just looking at the overall idea of the supporting cast, do think a little bit about, for instance, what you could do. For instance, on my account, if I had Nahida, because I don't right now, but I'm going to get her in the future. If I had Nahida, but for specifically this team, I had to use Barbara to go heavily against the Emperor Fire and Iron. But if, let's say, Rift had his, it was one of my friends, and if he put his Nilou up on his supporting cast, I probably would be grabbing his Nilou, and for that specific team, I would have had my Nahida, I would have had his Nilou and a Barbara, or possibly just another Hydro character, and that would have made a really solid team to go against the Emperor of Fire and Iron. Possibly would have made my life a little bit easier against that specific boss. But there are instances where you can help out your friends, you can help out other people. Yes, you can just sit there and kind of look at, okay, this time it's Anemo, Cryo, and Hydro. That's who I'm going to put in my supporting cast. But also look at the active cast. There's Dia, Xiangling, Emily, and Nahida. And so, that does help change who can be in your supporting cast and who people can use. For instance, there could be a team that you're thinking, okay, well, I don't want to do this team, but if you put up your Kaveh, for instance, technically you could also make an extremely good Bloom team there, putting up your Kaveh, and then if they already have the Nahida, then you've already got a great team. You could have also thrown up if Rift had thrown up his Toma, he could technically make a really good Burgeon team for other people if they use their Barbaras, because that was already there, with Farina and the Hinda that they already have, and then throw in, obviously here we don't have any Pyro characters except for now your friend's Toma. So there's a lot of different things and a lot of different characters that you could put up that actually could help people. And yes, you could, most of them should be looking at the 3 elements that were given, the Cryo, Anemo, and Hydro characters. But I would say and recommend in the future, if you guys are thinking about, other people, look at the active cast, look at the actual supporting cast, and then actually figure out who you actually want to put with where and how you can possibly help other people.
I think when it comes to the supporting cast and kind of knowing what characters you want to put on there, honestly, if you have a really powerful 5-star, maybe you have some constellations, then it becomes kind of obvious, like you would want to throw that one up. Because like one friend of mine, I used their C6 Yelan. It's like, well, who else would I kind of pick? Even though I have Yelan and her weapon, it's like, man, I just really want to go have fun with that. So if you have even just a C1 Yelan, because of that extra skill charge, a lot of players may not have that. And especially new players that are just now getting into Imaginarium Theatre, going to have a lot of fun playing around with that. Or even just throwing up your C6 Farazan. Even though Farazan is a trial character, if you have that C6, there is a player base out there that doesn't have that yet, and they may want to have fun with that because they're a Zhao main. You never know. So like, honestly, I don't think there's too many restrictions, obviously, to like what you put in your supporting cast, put what you want there, maybe to just kind of show off your characters. But I would say if you know that you kind of spec into one thing, or those characters are just, are really well built, then yeah, go ahead and throw them in there because they will get used. But if you throw a character in there that you just really like, but it doesn't really seem obvious that they would get used, like throwing in a character that isn't even, the element for this season. Like, what if I threw Ningguang in the roster? It's like, who's actually going to use that? And who knows? Maybe one player will, but it just doesn't make the most sense. Even if your Ningguang is like 300% crit damage and it absolutely goated. Looking at the special guest lineup, we had Nahida, Xiangling, Emily, and Dia. And I thought that was pretty interesting because this was, like we said, is pushing a lot of Hydro, Cryo, a lot of freeze type teams that you could do, or just mono Hydro, mono Cryo, whatever you want to do there. But seeing the Dendro and the Pyro in the special guest lineup was very interesting to me. And obviously, we know because Emily's in there, this Imaginarium Theater is going to be around by the time Emily drops soon. And maybe there will be some really fun and cool burning teams to do. But also because we're using some Hydro characters, maybe you can create some kind of Burgeon team. And actually, that was something I kind of wanted to try. I haven't tried it yet, but I could totally see it being really good. And just use one of your Hydro characters, maybe go double Hydro, and then just use your Nahida and Xiangling. Because believe it or not, Xiangling actually is very decent in a Burgeon comp because of her, straight pyro damage on Vaporize. If you do happen to get it, we all know that's good about her. But because she does go into Elemental Mastery quite a bit, and maybe you have that on her Sands, she naturally, because of that, does do okay with Burgeon. It's at least 10 to 15,000 on Burgeon hits if you're having like 200 to 400 Elemental Mastery on your Xiangling. So I think there's a lot of different things you could do. And honestly, the same thing can be said of Dia. If you want to just go into this Imaginarium Theater, rebuild the Dia for just full EM, you can just use her as a pure off-field Burgeon reactor, and that could work very well. So Vixen, are there any other final thoughts you might have on this Imaginarium Theater season? Do you actually like it? Did you like the characters, or what was your favorite part about it?
I think there's a lot of good parts about this Imaginarium Theater. Obviously, I do have a pretty heavy and extensive cryo teams on my account, so it's very fun to use those. Hydro characters are always fun to use, especially with Nevalette and Farina being some of the best characters in the game, especially being super, super strong. And I've always had a good affiliation with a lot of the Anemo characters as well, having a very strong Zhao and Wanderer. So those were extremely fun to use, in Shan Yun and Farazan, obviously. So there's a lot of cool characters that you could use. It's a little different than the last Imaginarium Theater we had, so it's really cool to see kind of the almost huge change we got here. And to see these three elements together was very good but different because, like you stated at the beginning of the video, it's almost quote-unquote out of meta. So to see a lot of things that were kind of forced, a freeze team that's not really that great right now, still be used in the Imaginarium Theater and be based off of melts and vaporizes still, and being thrown in some extra characters and teams where you could still, like you were talking about, make Burgeon teams and make some interesting melts and freeze and Burgeons and all these other extra things that could be added on top of it because of that active cast. It was very interesting to see a lot of what could be used and what can be used to go throughout this Imaginarium Theater we had.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. Once again, seeing the cryo kind of come back in. I even saw some people using Eula, which was pretty cool. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video and maybe kind of helped give you some tips or some insight on what to do if maybe you are struggling in the Imaginarium Theater just because of all the different lineups that are possible. But most of all, we hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we'll see you guys in the next video.